The universe is vast, filled with endless wonders and countless mysteries. Among the stars, where light travels for millennia to reach its destination, there exists a delicate balance between worlds, a balance often disturbed by greed, fear, or the desperate need to survive. In one such corner of the galaxy, where planets burn under two suns and moons shimmer like silver coins in an inky sky, a fragile alliance was on the brink of collapse. And at the heart of it all was a chance encounter between a human soldier and an alien princess, both trapped in the chaos of their unraveling destinies. The air was heavy with the acrid scent of charred metal and burning vegetation. The battlefield stretched endlessly, littered with broken machines and the remains of a once thriving forest. The hum of alien weaponry still lingered, like the ghost of a storm refusing to fade. Amidst the destruction, a lone human soldier trudged forward, his boots sinking into the ash-strewn ground. His face was grim, streaked with dirt and sweat, but his eyes burned with determination. He hadn't set out to be a hero, not today. His mission was clear: extract any survivors, neutralize threats, and return to base. But fate had other plans. Just as he rounded the remnants of a massive tree trunk, something caught his attention, a faint sound, almost like a whimper carried on the wind. He paused, scanning the area. His instincts, honed by years of combat, told him to stay alert. Yet, the sound tugged at something deeper, something human. Against his better judgment, he followed it, weaving through the wreckage until he found the source. There, slumped against a fallen pillar of alien architecture, was a figure unlike any he'd ever seen. Her skin glimmered faintly under the dim light, a soft hue of lavender marked with intricate patterns that seemed to shimmer and shift like starlight. Her eyes, though clouded with pain, held an otherworldly beauty, twin orbs of shimmering gold. The soldier froze, torn between caution and compassion. She was clearly not human, and her kind had been the enemy in this war. But in that moment, she didn't look like an adversary. She looked broken, vulnerable. She tried to speak, her voice weak and trembling. It wasn't in his language, but her tone conveyed everything: fear, desperation, and something that felt oddly like hope. She clutched her side, where a deep wound oozed a silvery liquid that was unmistakably her blood. Her breaths were shallow, each one a struggle. The soldier's training screamed at him to move on, to leave her. She was the enemy, and helping her could jeopardize his mission. But his humanity wouldn't let him walk away. Kneeling cautiously, he pulled a medkit from his pack. Her golden eyes widened in surprise and mistrust as he reached for her. He paused, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said softly, unsure if she could understand. "You're hurt. Let me help." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, then shifted to the chaos around them. A single tear slipped down her cheek, tracing a path through the grime on her face. Slowly, she nodded, as though surrendering not just to his aid but to the weight of her situation. The soldier worked quickly, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He couldn't heal her completely, but he could stop the bleeding, buy her time. As he bandaged her wound, she whispered something. Her voice was melodic, almost like a song, but the words were foreign. Still, the emotion behind them was clear. Gratitude. The soldier gave her a small nod, unsure of what else to say. They were from different worlds, quite literally, and yet, in this moment, they were connected by something universal: compassion, survival, the shared experience of vulnerability in the face of war. Their fragile peace was shattered by the distant sound of approaching footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and far too close for comfort. The soldier's heart pounded as he recognized the cadence. It wasn't human. His hand instinctively went to his weapon, and he shifted to shield the princess from view. Her golden eyes filled with fear as she gripped his arm, her delicate fingers trembling. She didn't need to say anything. He could feel her plea. They had to move. "Now, can you walk?" he asked urgently, gesturing for her to try. She winced but nodded, struggling to her feet. He supported her, his arm around her waist as they moved cautiously, avoiding the open areas. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by guttural voices and the mechanical hum of alien armor. They were being hunted. The soldier's mind raced, calculating their chances. He didn't know why she was here, why she was alone, or what her role was in the war. But he knew that if they were caught, neither of them would make it out alive. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, he felt a fierce need to protect her. Maybe it was because she reminded him of what was at stake in this war, the innocent lives caught in the crossfire. Or maybe it was because, despite their differences, she had trusted him. As they ducked into the shadows of a crumbling structure, the princess stopped suddenly, clutching a pendant around her neck. It was a simple piece, a small crystal that pulsed faintly with light. She whispered something, her voice urgent and filled with resolve. The crystal responded, glowing brighter, and for a moment the soldier felt a strange warmth wash over him. He didn't understand what she had done, but the light seemed to create a barrier around them, muffling the sounds of their movements. The alien patrol passed by, their voices fading into the distance. The soldier let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The princess sagged against him, her strength waning. Whatever she had done had taken a toll on her. "Thank you," he murmured, not expecting her to understand, but feeling the need to say it anyway. She managed a faint smile, her eyes meeting his with a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. But their reprieve was short-lived. A distant explosion shook the ground, and the soldier's radio crackled to life with frantic voices from his team. The battlefield was shifting, and their window for escape was closing fast. He looked at the princess, her fragile form barely holding together, and made a decision. He would get her to safety, no matter the cost. The universe might be vast, filled with wonders and mysteries, but in that moment it all boiled down to one simple truth. Sometimes, the most unexpected connections can change everything. And as the soldier led the alien princess into the unknown, he couldn't shake the feeling that their fates were more intertwined than either of them could imagine. The story was far from over, and the choices they made in the coming hours would ripple across galaxies. But for now, all they had was each other and the unspoken promise to survive. The forest stretched before them like a labyrinth of shadows, the broken terrain making every step a test of endurance. The soldier supported the princess as best as he could, his arm wrapped around her waist to keep her steady. She leaned into him, her breathing shallow and labored. He couldn't tell if it was the wound or the sheer exhaustion weighing her down, but either way, they didn't have time to stop. The enemy patrol was still too close for comfort, and the radio chatter in his ear suggested more chaos was unfolding nearby. He glanced at her, trying to make sense of the situation. Who was she? Why had she been left behind in such a dangerous area? And more importantly, why did the sight of her tears feel like a punch to his gut? He wasn't the type to get sentimental, not after everything he'd seen in this war. But there was something about her, something he couldn't quite explain. As they pressed forward, the soldier's mind churned with questions. The alien forces, often called the Radiant by those who fought against them, were notorious for their precision and discipline. They didn't leave their own behind, not unless there was no other choice. Yet, here she was, a princess. Judging by the regal way she carried herself and the intricate designs adorning her armor, her presence alone raised more questions than it answered. Was she a fugitive? A pawn in some larger game? Or had she simply been betrayed by her own people? The princess stirred, breaking his train of thought. She looked up at him, her golden eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. Her lips moved as if she was trying to speak, but her voice was too faint to carry. He frowned, wishing they could communicate properly. "Save your strength," he said softly, even though he knew she wouldn't understand. "We'll figure this out once we're safe." Safe. The word felt hollow in a place like this. The forest might have offered some cover, but it was still part of a war zone. Every sound, a snapping branch, the distant rumble of artillery made his hand tighten on his weapon. They had to keep moving, but without a clear destination, every step felt like a gamble. The princess reached out suddenly, her fingers brushing against his chest. She pointed toward a faint glow in the distance, barely visible through the dense trees. He hesitated. The light could mean anything: a campfire, a beacon, or even a trap. But the determination in her eyes was hard to ignore. She seemed certain, as if that distant glow held the answers they needed. With a sigh, he nodded and adjusted his grip on her. "All right," he murmured. "Let's see where this takes us." As they approached the light, the forest began to thin, giving way to a clearing. At its center stood a structure unlike anything the soldier had seen before. It was a crystalline formation, jagged and shimmering, with faint pulses of light running through it like veins of energy. The air around it buzzed faintly, charged with an almost electric tension. The princess straightened slightly, her eyes locked on the structure. There was a spark of recognition in her expression, and for the first time, she seemed more alive, more present. The soldier scanned the area, his instincts on high alert. The clearing was too open, too exposed. If anyone was watching, they'd be easy targets. But before he could voice his concerns, the princess pulled away from him, staggering toward the structure. He reached out to stop her, but she shook her head, gesturing urgently. There was no time to argue. He followed her, his weapon raised and ready for whatever might come. The closer they got, the more he felt the strange energy radiating from the structure. It wasn't just the hum in the air. It was something deeper, a feeling that resonated in his chest like a low, steady drumbeat. The princess placed her hand on the crystalline surface, and the light within it flared brighter, casting the clearing in a kaleidoscope of colors. Symbols began to appear, etched in light, swirling across the surface in patterns that made his head spin if he looked at them for too long. She murmured something, her voice stronger now, though still incomprehensible. The structure responded, its hum growing louder, more insistent. The soldier felt his heart race as a section of the crystal began to shift, splitting open to reveal a passageway leading downward. Cool air wafted up from the entrance, carrying a faint, metallic scent. The princess turned to him, her expression both hopeful and pleading. "You want us to go down there?" he asked, already knowing the answer. She nodded, her gaze unwavering. He let out a frustrated sigh. "Fine, but if this is a trap, I'm not going down without a fight." The passage was narrow and steep, the walls glowing faintly to light their way. The soldier kept his weapon at the ready, every step a calculated risk. The princess seemed more at ease, though her movements were still slow and careful. Whatever this place was, it meant something to her. He could see it in the way her fingers brushed the walls, as if she was reconnecting with something she'd lost. As they descended deeper, the soldier began to notice strange markings on the walls. They were similar to the symbols on the crystal above, but these seemed older, more worn. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though every time he glanced over his shoulder, the passage behind them was empty. Finally, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. The ceiling arched high above, supported by massive crystalline pillars that shimmered with an internal light. At the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it rested a sphere that glowed with an intense, shifting light. The princess approached it with a reverence he couldn't ignore, her hands trembling as she reached for the sphere. She hesitated, then turned to him, as if asking for his approval. "I don't know what this is," he said, lowering his weapon slightly. "But if it helps us survive, do what you need to do." She nodded and placed her hands on the sphere. The chamber lit up in a blinding flash, and the soldier shielded his eyes. When the light faded, the princess was still standing there, but the sphere now floated above the pedestal, spinning slowly. She looked at him, her expression more determined than before, and spoke a single word. It wasn't in his language, but it sounded almost familiar, like something he should have understood but didn't. Before he could ask what it meant, the chamber trembled. The pillars began to pulse with light, and the hum from the structure grew louder, almost deafening. The princess grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the exit. Whatever they'd just awakened, it wasn't safe to stick around. As they raced back up the passageway, the soldier's mind reeled. He didn't know what the sphere was, or why the princess seemed so desperate to protect it. But one thing was clear: they were no longer just running for their lives. They were carrying something far more important, something that others would stop at nothing to obtain. Emerging into the forest, the soldiers scanned the horizon. The distant sounds of battle were growing louder, creeping closer. Whatever fragile piece they'd found was slipping away. And as the princess clutched his arm, her golden eyes filled with both fear and resolve, he knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. The forest around them felt darker now, as if the act of taking the sphere had shifted something in the very air. The soldier kept his pace quick but steady, his grip on the princess's arm firm as he guided her through the uneven terrain. She moved with purpose, though he could see the exhaustion creeping back into her steps. The faint glow from the sphere still pulsed faintly in the bag slung over his shoulder, casting strange shadows across the twisted trees. Every instinct he had told him they were being followed. He couldn't hear the enemy's footsteps yet, but the feeling was undeniable, like a predator's breath on the back of his neck. He stopped suddenly, holding up a hand to signal the princess. She paused, tilting her head slightly, her golden eyes narrowing in understanding. He scanned the area, his ears straining for any hint of movement. The forest was too quiet, the usual background noises of rustling leaves and distant creatures conspicuously absent. Then he heard a faint, mechanical whirring, distant but closing fast. His stomach dropped. Drones. Of course, they'd send drones first. The Radiant forces were efficient hunters, and once they caught a trail, they wouldn't stop until they found their target. He turned to the princess, keeping his voice low but firm. "We need to move. Now." She nodded, her grip tightening on his arm as they started running again. The soldier could feel the weight of the sphere bouncing lightly against his side, a constant reminder of the danger they carried. He didn't know why it was so important, but the princess's urgency and the fact that their enemies were willing to comb the battlefield, for it told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just a relic. It was a weapon, or maybe a key. Either way, it was powerful enough to tip the scales of the war. The whirring grew louder, accompanied by flashes of light weaving through the trees. The soldier cursed under his breath, his mind racing for options. The drones were designed for precision strikes, and the open forest offered little cover. He spotted a cluster of large, moss-covered rocks ahead and made a split-second decision. Grabbing the princess's hand, he pulled her toward them and crouched low, motioning for her to stay quiet. The drones zipped past moments later, their sleek, metallic forms cutting through the air with lethal grace. The soldier held his breath, his heart hammering in his chest as he watched them scan the area. A faint blue light emanated from their sensors, sweeping across the forest floor like a searchlight. He tightened his grip on his weapon, ready to fire if they got too close, but the princess placed a hand on his arm, shaking her head. She pointed to the ground, then mimicked a small burst of light with her hands. He frowned, trying to decipher her meaning, but before he could ask, she closed her eyes and placed both palms flat on the ground. The air around them seemed to shimmer, and the soldier felt a strange sensation, like the world had shifted slightly out of focus. The drones slowed, their sensors flickering as if they were struggling to process their surroundings. Then, one by one, they turned and flew off in another direction, their whirring fading into the distance. The soldier let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The princess opened her eyes, the faint glow from her hands fading. She gestured to the sphere in his bag, then to her temple, as if trying to convey that the power came from both her and the artifact. He nodded slowly, his respect for her growing despite the language barrier. She wasn't just running, she was fighting in her own way, even when the odds were stacked against her. Their reprieve was short-lived. A sudden explosion in the distance rattled the ground beneath them, sending a flock of alien birds screeching into the sky. The soldier's radio crackled to life, the panicked voices of his team cutting through the static. They were under heavy fire, pinned down at a nearby extraction point. His orders were clear: rendezvous with them and secure the sphere. But as he glanced at the princess, her fragile form leaning against a rock for support, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. "You're not going to like this," he muttered, pulling out a small tracking device from his pack. He placed it gently in her hand and gestured for her to keep it hidden. "If we get separated, this will lead me to you. But we need to keep moving. They'll be back." The princess's eyes widened slightly, and she hesitated before nodding. She clutched the device tightly, her expression a mix of trust and uncertainty. They set off again, moving as quickly as they could through the forest. The soldier's thoughts raced with every step. He needed to get her to safety, but the extraction point was miles away, and the enemy was closing in from all sides. The tension between them grew heavier with each passing moment. She seemed to sense it too, glancing at him with a question in her eyes he couldn't answer. Every time he thought they had a moment to breathe, the forest would betray them a distant sound, a flicker of movement, something that reminded them just how close the danger was. It wasn't long before the next confrontation came. They reached the edge of a ravine, its sheer cliffs stretching endlessly in both directions. A single, precarious bridge spanned the gap, its wooden planks weathered and creaking under the weight of the wind. The soldier stopped, his jaw tightening as he surveyed their options. Crossing it was their only chance, but it would leave them exposed. Before he could decide, a sharp crack echoed behind them, followed by the unmistakable sound of energy weapons firing. He spun around, his weapon raised as a group of radiant soldiers emerged from the shadows, their forms sleek and menacing in the dim light. The princess let out a soft gasp, her hands instinctively reaching for him as he pushed her behind him. "Go!" he shouted, gesturing toward the bridge. I'll hold them off." She hesitated, her eyes wide with fear, but his tone left no room for argument. She turned and began to cross, her movements careful but swift. The soldier fired a warning shot, the crack of his rifle echoing through the ravine. The radiant soldiers hesitated, their alien voices barking orders as they regrouped. He used the moment to follow the princess, his eyes constantly darting back to ensure they weren't overrun. The bridge groaned ominously under their combined weight, swaying with each step. The radiant forces opened fire, their energy blasts striking the wooden planks and sending splinters flying. The soldier turned and fired back, his shots precise and calculated. But they were outnumbered, and the bridge wasn't going to hold much longer. As they reached the other side, the princess stumbled, her foot catching on a loose plank. The soldier grabbed her arm, pulling her to safety just as the bridge gave a final, violent shudder. It collapsed into the ravine below, taking 2 pursuing soldiers with it. The others stopped at the edge, their weapons raised but unable to follow. The soldier pulled the princess behind cover, both of them breathing hard. The adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, but his mind was already racing ahead. They'd bought themselves a few minutes, maybe more, but it wasn't over. It never was. The soldier leaned against the jagged rocks, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps as the adrenaline began to wane. The princess sat beside him, cradling the sphere in her lap. The glow from the artifact illuminated her face, casting her delicate features in a soft light that made her look almost otherworldly. But her exhaustion was plain to see, and the soldier couldn't ignore the faint tremor in her hands as she clung to the sphere like it was the only thing anchoring her to this moment. They'd escaped the immediate threat, but he knew the radiant forces wouldn't give up so easily. The loss of the bridge would slow them down, but it wouldn't stop them. His team's voices on the radio had gone silent, and that silence gnawed at him more than any enemy fire ever could. If they were still alive, they were counting on him to deliver the sphere, and now the princess to the extraction point. But the journey ahead felt impossibly long. The princess shifted suddenly, pulling his attention back to her. She pointed toward the sky, where faint streaks of light arced overhead. At first, he thought it was just the glow of distant flares, but as the streaks grew brighter and more defined, he realized they were ships, radiant ships, descending fast. His heart sank. They weren't just searching anymore. They were deploying reinforcements. "We're running out of time," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He reached for his pack and began checking his gear. They'd need to move soon, but with the ships overhead, their window of escape was narrowing. The princess touched his arm, stopping him. She pointed to the sphere, then gestured toward the forest ahead, her movements urgent. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, he saw something that sent a chill down his spine. Desperation. Yes, but also guilt. He didn't have time to dwell on it, but the feeling lingered as they packed up and started moving again. The forest grew denser, the farther they went, the canopy above closing in until only slivers of light filtered through. The soldier could hear the hum of the ships above, their searchlights cutting through the trees like giant, unblinking eyes. The princess stayed close to him, her movements careful but deliberate. She seemed to know where she was going, even if he didn't. Then, just as the tension felt unbearable, they stumbled into another clearing. But this one wasn't empty. At its center stood a small, ancient-looking structure, its stone walls covered in moss and strange carvings. The princess froze, her gaze fixed on the structure with an intensity that made the soldier uneasy. She stepped forward, her hand brushing against the carvings as if she recognized them. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice low. She didn't answer, Not that he expected her to, but her expression spoke volumes. This place was important, sacred even. The sphere in her hands began to glow brighter, and the carvings responded, lighting up with the same eerie energy. The air around them grew thick with that strange electric hum, and the soldier's unease deepened. Before he could ask another question, the ground beneath them trembled. Carvings flared brighter, and a low rumble filled the clearing. The soldier stepped back, his weapon raised as the structure began to shift. The stone walls parted like petals of a blooming flower, revealing a hidden chamber within. The princess stepped forward, her movements hesitant but determined, and gestured for him to follow. "I don't like this," he muttered, but he followed her anyway, his grip on his weapon tightening. The chamber inside was even more surreal. Crystalline structures jutted out from the walls, pulsating with light. At the center of the room was another pedestal, similar to the one they'd found earlier, but this one was larger, more ornate. It seemed to call to the sphere, its light growing stronger as the princess approached. But before she could place the sphere on the pedestal, a deafening roar erupted from the forest. The soldier spun around, his weapon aimed at the entrance as a radiant strike team burst into the clearing. These soldiers were different, larger, more heavily armored, and armed with weapons that made his rifle look like a toy. The leader, a towering figure with glowing eyes, barked an order in their alien tongue, and the team spread out, surrounding the structure. The princess turned to the soldier, her eyes wide with fear. She spoke quickly, her words a flurry of sounds he couldn't understand. But he didn't need a translator to know what she was saying. "They can't take the sphere." "Get behind me," he said, his voice firm. He knew he couldn't take on the entire strike team, but he'd be damned if he let them get to her. The princess hesitated, then nodded, clutching the sphere tightly as she stepped back. The radiant soldiers moved in, their weapons trained on the soldier. He fired the first shot, the crack of his rifle echoing through the chamber. One of the soldiers dropped, but the others returned fire almost immediately, their energy blasts tearing through the stone walls. The soldier dove for cover, his mind racing. They were outmatched, outnumbered, and running out of time. The princess, however, wasn't idle. She clutched the sphere tightly, her face a mask of concentration. The crystalline structures in the chamber began to glow brighter, their light pulsating in sync with the sphere. The air grew heavier, charged with an energy that made the hair on the soldier's arms stand on end. Then, without warning, the sphere unleashed a shockwave of light. The soldier felt it pass through him like a gust of wind, but the radiant soldiers weren't so lucky. The shockwave hit them like a tidal wave, sending them sprawling to the ground. Their weapons fizzled and sparked, rendered useless by the energy surge. For a brief, fleeting moment, the chamber was silent. The soldier lowered his weapon, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened. The princess sank to her knees, the sphere still glowing faintly in her hands. But the relief was short-lived. The leader of the strike team was still standing, his glowing eyes locked onto the princess. He spoke again, his voice low and menacing, and stepped forward. The soldier didn't hesitate. He fired his rifle, but the leader raised a hand and the bullet stopped midair, disintegrating into dust. The soldier's blood ran cold. He'd seen a lot in this war, but nothing like this. The leader reached out, his hand crackling with energy, and the soldier knew they were out of options. And then the princess did something unexpected. She stood, holding the sphere aloft, and shouted a single word. The sphere flared brighter than ever, bathing the chamber in blinding light. The soldier shielded his eyes, his heart pounding as the light grew hotter, more intense. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light vanished, leaving them in darkness. When the soldier opened his eyes, the chamber was empty. The radiant leader was gone, and so were his soldiers. But the sphere was still glowing, and the princess stood at its center, her expression a mixture of triumph and sorrow. Whatever she'd done, it wasn't over. And as the soldier looked at her, he realized the stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. The soldier's breath caught as the blinding light slowly faded, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. The chamber felt impossibly quiet, as though the explosion of energy had stripped the air of its usual hum. He lowered his weapon cautiously, his gaze darting to the princess. She stood at the center of the room, her shoulders rising and falling with deep, measured breaths. The sphere floated just above her palms, its glow softer now but more focused, as if it had found a new purpose. Before he could speak, the sound of stone grinding against stone made him whirl around. The pedestal at the center of the chamber was shifting again, its surface splitting open to reveal a compartment hidden within. Inside lay an object unlike anything the soldier had ever seen, a delicate crystalline shard, pulsing faintly with the same energy as the sphere. The princess stepped forward, her movements deliberate, and reached for it with trembling hands. "Wait," the soldier said, his voice sharp with urgency. "We don't know what that is. This might be what they wanted all along." She paused, her eyes meeting his. There was something different in her gaze now, something resolute and unyielding. Without a word, she touched the shard, and the entire room came alive. The carvings on the walls lit up again, their patterns shifting and flowing like rivers of light. The air grew heavy with a low, resonant hum, and the soldier felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. He staggered, using his weapon to steady himself as the princess held the shard aloft. The chamber was a nexus. He realized a key to something far greater than he or even the radiant forces could comprehend. But as awe turned to dread, he saw the look of pain etched across the princess's face. The shard's energy was coursing through her, but it wasn't benign. It was consuming her, draining her in a way that made the soldier's gut twist. He moved toward her, his instincts screaming to intervene, but she raised a hand, stopping him. Her voice was soft and melodic, like the chiming of bells, but he couldn't understand her words. Yet he didn't need to. Her eyes told him everything. She wasn't just protecting the sphere or the shard. She was trying to stop something, a calamity far worse than any war. And she knew the cost. "No," he said, his voice breaking. "There has to be another way." The princess shook her head, tears glistening in her golden eyes. She reached out and touched his shoulder, her expression filled with a quiet kind of sorrow that cut deeper than any wound. Then she turned back to the pedestal, placing the shard into the sphere. The moment the two connected, the entire chamber erupted with light. The soldier shielded his face as the energy surged outward, a blinding wave that felt like it would tear the universe apart. The walls around them crumbled, and he was thrown to the ground, his weapon skidding out of reach. He looked up just in time to see the princess at the epicenter, her form bathed in radiant light. She was glowing, her body almost translucent, as if she was becoming one with the energy itself. And then the twist came. The energy didn't just dissipate, it reversed. The light contracted inward, pulling everything back into the sphere with an almost deafening roar. The princess screamed, a sound that echoed through the soldier's very bones, and then she was gone. The sphere fell to the ground with a heavy thud, its glow extinguished. The silence that followed was deafening. The soldier pushed himself up, his body aching, and crawled toward the sphere.
His hands trembled as he picked it up, its surface cool and lifeless now.
He stared at it, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. She was gone. The one person who had been guiding him through this impossible journey, who had risked everything to protect this artifact, was gone. But the chamber wasn't entirely empty. As the dust settled, he saw something glimmering faintly on the ground, a small golden pendant. He recognized it instantly. It had been around the princess's neck, a token she'd clung to even in the worst moments. He picked it up, his throat tightening as he turned it over in his hands. It was warm, as if it still carried some part of her essence. The sound of approaching footsteps jolted him back to reality. He scrambled to his feet, gripping the sphere tightly, as three familiar figures emerged from the rubble his team. They were battered and bruised, but alive, their faces a mixture of relief and disbelief as they spotted him. "We thought we'd lost you," one of them said, his voice tinged with awe as he took in the destruction around them. "What happened here?" The soldier hesitated, his gaze falling to the sphere. "She saved us," he said quietly, "and she stopped them." His teammate nodded, but there was no time for questions. The Radiant forces were still out there, and the extraction point was still their only way out. The soldier tucked the sphere into his pack, his grip tightening on the pendant as he followed his team out of the ruins. As they moved through the forest, the soldier couldn't shake the feeling that the princess wasn't entirely gone. The pendant seemed to pulse faintly against his chest, a comforting warmth that made him wonder if some part of her had stayed behind, not in the sphere, but in him. He didn't know what the shard or the sphere would mean for the war, or if they would ever truly understand what they had uncovered. But one thing was clear: her sacrifice had given them a chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. Above, the skies were still filled with radiant ships, their searchlights cutting through the darkness. But for the first time, the soldier felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. And as they pushed forward, he silently vowed to honor the princess's legacy, no matter what came next. The war wasn't over, but the fight had changed, and so had he. The forest was still, save for the soft crunch of boots against the underbrush. The soldier moved in silence, the pendant clutched tightly in one hand while his other stayed close to his weapon. His teammates flanked him, their faces tense but resolute. There were no words exchanged as they moved toward the extraction point. The weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on his mind, but he knew the mission wasn't over. The sphere still needed to make it to safety, and he wouldn't let the princess's sacrifice be in vain. As they broke through the tree line, the faint hum of an approaching transport ship reached their ears. Relief flickered in the soldier's chest, but it was fleeting. The sky was still filled with radiant ships, and it wouldn't take long before they zeroed in on the transport's location. He signaled to his team, quick gestures that conveyed urgency without words. They picked up their pace, weaving through the uneven terrain toward the clearing where the transport would land. The soldier couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift, every rustle of leaves a warning. His instincts screamed at him to stay alert, and his grip on the pendant tightened. It was warm against his palm, a small, steady reminder of the princess's presence. He didn't understand the energy it seemed to hold, but he wasn't ready to let go of it, not yet. When they reached the clearing, the transport ship was already descending, its engines kicking up a whirlwind of dirt and debris. The soldier motioned for his team to fan out and secure the perimeter. The extraction was supposed to be quick, but he knew better than to trust the promise of an easy exit. As the ramp lowered and the pilot waved them in, the soldier's gut twisted. Something didn't feel right. He was the last to board, his weapon raised as he scanned the tree line one final time. The moment he stepped onto the ship, the first shots rang out. Bright streaks of energy tore through the clearing, forcing the pilot to raise the ramp before they could even return fire. The soldier dove for cover as the transport lurched into the air, the sound of enemy fire ringing in his ears. "Hold on," the pilot shouted, jerking the controls to avoid an incoming barrage. The soldier braced himself, the sphere tucked securely in his pack as the ship pitched and rolled. His teammates fired back through the narrow viewports, their shouts drowned out by the roar of the engines. The radiant ships were in pursuit, their weapons blazing as they closed in. The soldier's mind raced. The sphere wasn't just a target, it was a beacon. The radiant forces wouldn't stop until they had it, and every second they spent in the air increased the risk of being shot down. He glanced at the pendant in his hand, its faint glow steady and calm despite the chaos around him. It was a long shot, but he didn't see any other way. He made his way to the cockpit, steadying himself against the jolting ship. The pilot barely glanced at him, too focused on evading the incoming fire. "What are you doing up here?" the pilot shouted over the noise. "We're not gonna make it if I don't. Just trust me," the soldier interrupted, holding up the pendant. He didn't know if it would work, but he had to try. He pressed the pendant to the sphere, closing his eyes as he focused on the warmth radiating from it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a pulse of energy surged through the cabin, so strong it made the lights flicker. The soldier opened his eyes to see the radiant ships falter, their weapons suddenly dimming, as if the energy had been sapped from them. The pilot didn't waste the opportunity, pushing the engines to their limit as the transport shot toward the clouds. The soldier sagged against the console, his heart pounding as the clearing disappeared beneath them. When they finally broke through the atmosphere, the tension in the cabin eased, though no one dared to celebrate. The soldier sat back, the sphere still glowing faintly in his lap. The pendant felt cool now, its energy spent, but he could still feel its weight, a quiet reminder of what had been lost. The days that followed were a blur of debriefings and uneasy silence. The sphere was handed over to the scientists and strategists who would determine its next steps, but the soldier couldn't bring himself to let go of the pendant. It felt too personal, too tied to everything they'd been through. The princess's face lingered in his mind, her final moments etched into his memory like a scar. He spent hours alone, turning the pendant over in his hands and wondering if he'd made the right choices. The war hadn't ended with the radiant forces retreating. It had simply shifted. The sphere was a weapon, a source of power that could tip the scales in their favor, but at what cost? The princess had known what it could do, and she'd still chosen to sacrifice herself to keep it safe. That thought haunted him more than anything. Months passed, and the soldier found himself stationed at a remote outpost, far from the front lines. The quiet should have been a relief, but it only gave him more time to think. He spent his nights staring at the stars, wondering if she was out there somewhere, if some part of her had survived in the energy that had consumed her. The pendant never left his side. One night, as he sat on the outpost's roof, the pendant began to glow faintly. He stared at it, his heart pounding as the light grew brighter. It wasn't the harsh, otherworldly glow of the sphere. It was soft, gentle, and warm. The light formed shapes, patterns he recognized from the carvings in the chamber. And then he heard it, her voice, faint but unmistakable. She wasn't gone, not completely. The energy that had taken her had also preserved her, a fragment of her consciousness tied to the pendant. Her words were faint, more feeling than sound, but they filled him with a sense of peace he hadn't felt since that day in the chamber. She was still guiding him even now,